Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to factor trinomials. So it's a polynomial with three terms that has this form. Now, notice that for this lesson, for this particular uh, section, the coefficient of the square term, x squared, is 1. So that's what we'll be focusing on in this lesson. In the next lesson, the coefficient will be a number other than 1. As you go through the process, we're going to talk about some ideas that's going to help you in the next section. But in this section, we're only focusing on trinomials. Remember, trinomial is a polynomial with three terms where the coefficient of x squared is 1. All right, so um, for example, x squared plus 4x plus 3. So notice the coefficient of x squared is 1. Another example would be where we factor x squared minus 8x plus 15, x squared plus 4x minus 12, and x squared minus x minus 42. As we go through this lesson, I want you to understand that we're going to discuss, see how the last sign is positive, how this last sign is positive, how this last sign is negative, how this last sign is negative. As we go through that, we're going to talk about, well, the last sign is positive, and I want the middle sign to be positive. What must the factors look like? If I want the last sign to be positive and I want the middle sign to be negative, what must the factors look like? The sign of the factors. If I if I want the last sign to be negative and I want the middle sign to be positive, what must the signs of the factors look like? And so on. Okay, so we're going to have that discussion as well. Okay, so let's look at this example. Before we do that, just a reminder, recall that factoring. All right, so recall that factoring means to write as a product. Remember in the last section. So recall that factoring means to write as a product. So remember when we talked about the GCF in the last section. So that's as a product. We had the GCF times a polynomial. All right, and that factoring and multiplying are reverse processes. Okay, so recall that factoring means to rise a product, and that factoring and multiplying are reverse processes. So, for example, when at the beginning of this chapter, you are asked to multiply these two binomials together. All right, so notice that you have two binomials, so you can use the FOIL method. So first times first is x squared. The outer, remember the outer, is x. There's your outer. Your inner is 3x, so there's your inner. And then your last is positive 3. Positive 3 times 1 is a positive 3. All right, and then combining these two like terms, we get x squared plus 4x plus 3. All right, so when I ask you to factor, when we say factor x squared plus 4x plus 3, you're basically going to go backwards and you come up with this is the answer. So you're going to rewrite this as the product of factors. And so my product of factors, my factors are going to be x plus 3 times x plus 1. So the goal in this lesson is to factor this trinomial as a product of two binomials. Okay? So that'll be the goal of this lesson. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to extend this, but in this lesson, that'll be the goal. So factor a trinomial that has a coefficient of 1 into 2 binomials. Okay? All right. So let's look at this example. So we're going to factor. And let's say we wanted to factor x squared plus 7x plus 6. So x squared plus 7x plus 6. All right, so again, first thing you always want to do when factoring these, so you notice that I'm going to discuss that every time, is to see if these three terms has a GCF other than 1. So the GCF here is 1. So since the GCF is 1, I'm not going to rewrite it as GCF times, in the last lesson, the GCF times whatever gives me that back. All right, so the GCF is 1. So I'm going to go directly to finding two factors. I want to find two factors whose product will give me this. Now remember, you're going to use FOIL to help you. So you can use FOIL to try and help you to come up with this. Okay? So remember FOIL, F-O-I-L. So that's going to help you. So the first is going to be easy, this one right here. So I need two factors, I want to say numbers, but it's not numbers. So two factors, what times what is x squared. All right, so the possibility here is just x times x. So x times x is x squared. So in fact, as we do this lesson where the coefficient of x squared is 1, this will always be either x squared, x times x. If your variable is y, it will be y times y, and so on. That's how it's always going to look. Okay, and then let's look at the last. So my last right here. Remember how we get the last in the FOIL. Remember how we got the last here. We said the last term of each binomial. So the last term here is positive 3. The last term here is a positive 1. And when I multiply them out, I get a positive 3. So that's how I get the last. So I want a positive 6. Okay? I want a positive 6. So there are two possibilities for positive 6. I can either say 6 and 1, or I can say negative 6 and negative 1, because negative 6 times negative 1 is a positive 6. I can say 3 times 2, because 3 times 2 is a positive 6. Or I can say negative 3 times negative 2, because a negative 3 times a negative 2 is a positive 6. Okay, so those are the only possibilities. Those are the only possibilities where that can fit in here. All right, but only one of these is correct. But those are the possibilities that can fit in here. Now let's think about this for a moment. I want you to think about this. Okay, let's go back to this. Remember, the outer and the inner, when I add them up, gives me 4x. Okay, and that was that middle term here. So this right here, that was that middle term. So my middle term was a positive 4x. And the only way I can get that positive 4x is if the outer was a positive 1x and the inner was a positive 3x. So I want you to think about that with this. Okay? So I want two numbers here whose product is 6. So it would be one of these. But I want the outer and the inner. I want the outer and the inner. The outer and the inner. I want the outer and inner to add to be 7x. Okay? So let's think about this. All right, so I'm gonna write this down. I want the product to be 6. Okay? I want the product to be 6. And I want the sum to be 7. All right? So I want the product to be 6, and I want the sum to be 7. So if I look at this sum here, let's do this sum. If I look at this sum right here, that sum is a negative 7. So that's not what I want. I want a positive 7. Now there'll be situations where you're going to notice that this is the opposite of what you want, so you just change the sign. So it looks like the only thing that would work would be this one. That does give me 7. This right here gives me 5, so that wouldn't work. So the only ones that would work would be 6 and 1. All right, positive 6 and a positive 1. So that means, and again, it does not matter where you put this for this where the leading coefficient is 1. It really does not matter. So you're going to say x plus 6, x plus 1. All right, and so that's how you do that. So always check yourself. It's a good idea to check yourself using a FOIL. X times x is x squared. A positive 6 times a positive 1 is a positive 6. The outer is x. The inner is 6x. When I add them up, I get 7x, and that's what you wanted. Okay? All right, now before we do the other one, remember what I eventually used. I eventually used the idea of product. Give me two numbers whose product is 6, and whose sum, when I do the outer and inner, and whose sum is 7x. So product is 6, and sum is 7x. Now, before I go on, remember when we introduced this lesson, let me go here. When we introduced this lesson, remember 6 right here, that 6 is your constant. Remember, this is the constant. There's no variable here, so it's a constant. And then the 7 is a coefficient of the x term, so that's b. All right, so I'm going to go back here. So I wanted to find two numbers whose product is c, and whose sum is b, this coefficient right here. Okay, so the coefficient here is a positive 7. All right, okay, now let's look at the next one. Number 2. Let's suppose we had y squared minus 10y plus 9. Y squared minus 10y plus 9. All right, so I'm going to use this idea again. Now remember, first of all, the GCF is 1. The GCF is 1. So I'm going to go directly to finding two binomials whose product is this. So that's how you're going to factor it. So in factoring a trinomial, if the GCF is 1, then you're going to go directly to the two binomials. What times what will give me this. Okay? So let's use let's use the idea of product and sum and the idea of FOIL. All right, so in the next section, you're going to use the idea of FOIL to help you through this. So let's think about it using FOIL as we go through all these problems. So always go to F first, the first. What times what is y squared? So you want to get that first term. So first times first is first. So y times y is y squared. So I know right away I'm going to need y's here. Okay? All right, now remember I want the last to be a positive 9. I want that product. Remember, what times what's a positive 9? So I need that product. I need the product to be C, and C in this case is a positive 9. All right, and remember, whatever I put here, I want to look at the out and the inner. Okay, remember that? The out and the inner. And I want the out and the inner to add to be a negative 10. So I want the sum to be negative 10, which is B. All right. So the product is this constant, 9. So don't memorize product has to be C and product has to be B. Think about the FOIL. The product here, last times last is positive 9. And when I do the out and the inner, that gives you that middle term back. Okay, so that I need the sum to be negative 10. Now, you'll be able to many times just come up with the answer right away. But just for our purposes, let's suppose we said 3 and 3. Because 3 times 3 is 9. But the issue is that when I add them up, when I look at the sum is 6, but that's not what I wanted. I wanted a negative 10. So you might say, well, what about 9 and 1? Okay, well, 9 times 1 is 9. That is true. But when I add them up, when I look at the sum, I get 10. But I want a negative 10. So I'm almost there. So see how this 10 and what I need, those are opposites of each other? So that means all I got to do is change the signs of my two factors. So I'm going to need a negative 9 and a negative 1, and that is the one that's going to work because when I add them up, I do get negative 10. And so all you do now is just, it doesn't matter in what order you put, you can say y minus 1 and then y minus 9. It does not matter. Or you can say y minus 9 times y minus 1, because remember, multiplication is commutative. The order in which you multiply does not matter. 5 times 6 is the same as 6 times 5. So y minus 1 is the same times y minus 9 is the same as y minus 9 times y minus 1. Okay? All right, so always check yourself though using FOIL. Remember, this is what we're using. First times first, y times y is y squared. The last, a negative 9 times a negative 1 is a positive 9. And then you got to check the outer and the inner. The outer is, you can do this in your head, but the outer is negative y, the inner is negative 9y. When I add them up, a negative 9 and a negative 1 is a negative 10y. Okay? All right. Now, before we go on, I want you to think about these rules. You see how the last sign's positive, and that's going to help you in the next section as well. How the last sign is positive. So, and the last sign's positive here. So, in order to get a positive, remember, in order to get a positive, and remember to get this last sign, I'm saying last times last. So, in order to get a positive, these signs in here, they have to be the same. Either they're both positive, because a positive times a positive is a positive, or they're both negative, because a negative times a negative is a positive. Okay? If the last sign's positive, if your constant is positive, that's the easiest trinomial to determine the signs. Because if the last sign's positive, remember the signs have to be the same. Either they're both positive or they're both negative. And the signs you use will be the coefficient, the sign of the coefficient of your x term. So it'll be the sign of b. So if this is positive, see how this is negative? See how this is positive? They were both positive, because the only way you can add, if the signs are the same, the only way you can do that to get a positive back is if they're both positive. A positive number plus another positive number is a positive number. Here, their last sign's positive, so these had to be negative because my middle sign is negative. So remember, a negative plus another negative is a negative. Okay? All right. Let's look at number 3. Okay. Suppose we had, let's see, x squared minus 6x plus 9. So x squared minus 6x plus 9. All right. So again, the GCF here is 1. So the GCF is 1. So I'm going to go directly, and I'm going to factor this as 2 binomials. Okay, 2 binomials. And right away, the answer is either one of these. So we'll circle one of those. Okay, 2 binomials. So I know that in terms of FOIL, first times first has to be x squared. So I know that this has to be x and x. Okay? Now, let's think about our rule for right now, the rule of the signs. So just remind ourselves what we just said. See how that last sign's positive? The only way that can happen is if these signs are the same. Because a negative times a negative is a positive times a positive is a negative. But you know now that the signs in here have to be negative, because when you do the outer and the inner, The out is going to be negative, the inner is going to be negative, and a negative plus another negative is a negative. They can be positive because a positive and a positive is a positive, and you need this to be negative. Okay? All right, so just keep that in mind as you go through this section and the next section. All right, so f is okay so far. X times x is x squared. Now let's go to the last. So I want to find two numbers whose product is 9. So I need the product to be 9, and I need the sum to be -6. Now don't say 6 because the coefficient is -6. You gotta make sure that you write the correct coefficient. Same thing here. This coefficient is -10, so that's why I put -10 and not 10. Okay, so be careful. So that's -6. So I want to find two numbers whose product is 9 and whose sum is -6. All right, so you could say, what about 3 and 3? Okay, well, 3 and 3 times 3 is 9, but when I look at the sum, I get a +6. So I wanted a -6. So since I know that these are opposites, all I've got to do is change these signs here. So I'm going to have to use -3 and -3, and the sum is -6. So those are the two numbers I'm going to use. And so now I'll just put them in here. X minus 3, x minus 3. All right, now before we go on, let's check the FOIL. Let's just make sure we have this correct now. So we did the out and the inner already. Okay, so x times x is x squared. -3 times -3 is a +9. When I look at the outer, -3x. When I look at the inner, -3x, and when I add them up, I get -6x, which is what I wanted. So this is your answer. All right. Now, before we go on, just notice, see how these two factors are the same? They're the same factors. There's another way you can write this. You can write this as x minus 3 squared. Because remember, x minus 3 squared means x minus 3 times itself. All right. Okay, so this video right here is almost a little over 20 minutes. So I'm going to kind of review this, and then we're going to look at the next lesson where this sign is negative. So in these problems right here, notice that the last sign was positive in all of these. So notice that the last sign's positive. The signs in the parentheses and your binomials will be the same. Either they're both positive or they're both negative. And same thing here. And the sign that you use takes that middle sign. All right, and also notice that as we did this, we used the idea of product and sum in all these cases, and we always checked ourselves using FOIL. And as we went through this, we did use FOIL to help us come up with this answer. Okay?